Welcome to Gentleness and Political Legitimacy, Talk 5. Shakespeare's Henry IV and the Right by Conquest. So if you haven't watched the 4 talks or short videos that precede this, I strongly encourage you to do so. They provide the essential background without which this video will make even less sense. So first I'd like you to ask a question. Think about this. What is more likely to improve government? A long period of peace and stability or a sudden disruption, for example, a coup or a revolution, or maybe even an external invasion? So if you need a little more time to think about this or to talk about it, go ahead and pause the video while I continue. But before we talk about Henry IV, we should consider the English situation in which he becomes king. And then we'll compare that to France, where you have a solid dynastic succession by inheritance. But in England, especially in the early part of the second millennium, you have frequent dynastic shifts by conquest. And this gives rise to a robust tradition of right by conquest, which is a legal framework within which conquest, which is a fact, can be acknowledged and can also be brought into the institutions of government so that there's not a complete collapse. So you have changes at the top, which of course include changes at mid-level and so on, but you don't have a complete destruction. Institutions are clearly defined and are able to continue due to the legal framework of right by conquest. And even where right by conquest isn't specifically asserted, because there are a small number of sovereigns in England who assert the right by conquest as a legal claim, the fact of right by conquest, the legal framework which makes it possible, enables a larger number of transitions by seizure of the crown, or what they call usurpation, where no such claim has been made, no specific right by conquest claim has been made. So the Plantagenet line, which is disrupted by Henry IV, is, although he's a subsidiary branch of it, had transitioned from king to king largely by primogeniture for 150 to 250 years. And the first 100 years are a little shakier before Henry IV usurped in 1399. Now, usurpation means that he took the crown by force and did not regularize his claim through specific legal mechanism for right by conquest. Henry IV was persuaded by his advisors, against his better judgment, to claim the throne from Richard II by a complicated hereditary claim called agnate primogeniture, or agnative primogeniture. And that's not worth explaining right here. But the point is that the monarch who he probably ordered Richard II starved to death, the monarch who he replaced by force and probably killed, but there were others ahead of Henry, even after Richard was gone. So making a hereditary claim at that point was not strengthening Henry's claim, and he himself had wanted to assert right by conquest. There are a number of monarchs who have claimed right by conquest, most notably William of Normandy, who became William I when he conquered England in 1066 and formally asserted right by conquest. The disputed King Louis I, who interrupts the Plantagenet reign, but he doesn't take sufficient control of government that his right by conquest is recognized. So that's an incomplete assertion there. During the Wars of the Roses, so after Henry IV takes over, because he makes a claim that is hereditary, he reinforces the principle of the hereditary claim. So you remember we talked about how the principal is not the principal. Well, if you strengthen the principle, then you strengthen the claim of anyone else, of any principal who may have a better claim than you on the basis of that principle. As a result of making the hereditary claim, which was not strong, reinforced the claim of the York family, the House of York. And over the next 100 years, the Wars of the Roses transferred the crown back and forth between the two houses. The Yorks had the stronger hereditary claim. Henry's claim and the Lancaster claim, his descendants, was based on heroic credentials, you could say, and should have been based on the right by conquest. But you can see how strengthening the hereditary claim, if you don't have the best hereditary claim, strengthens anyone who has a better one than you. Similarly, presenting yourself as a warrior, if you're not, makes you more vulnerable to the claims of other people who may make a claim based on warriorship or heroic credentials. Finally, in 1485, Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII. He deposes Richard III, the infamous Richard III, and establishes the Tudors, ends the Wars of the Roses, and that's the last instance of right by conquest in English history, with one sort of exception. So Charles I is put to death in a revolution and is replaced briefly by what's called the Rump Parliament, which is sort of like the Articles of Confederation in the United States. They don't have a strong chief executive. A powerful military leader disposes of the parliament and installs himself as Lord Protector. That's Oliver Cromwell. Now, Cromwell attempts to pass this protectorate. So he rules for about 5 years. And he attempts to pass the protectorate to his very non-heroic son, Richard. Now, Richard Cromwell, in particular, does not have the confidence of the army that put Oliver Cromwell in power. So by passing the crown, it's not a crown at that point, and Cromwell does not claim right by conquest because he's not taking the crown. He claims to be Lord Protector. By passing the protectorate to his son, Richard, he strengthens the principle of procedural or hereditary succession, and thereby strengthens the claim of Charles II, the son of Charles I, who is off in France waiting to take the throne back. It paves the way for Charles' eventual restoration after a year. Because Cromwell had reasserted the principle of procedural succession, even though he himself had used force to take control from Parliament and to install himself as Lord Protector, he created a situation which worked against him and his line, of course. So Richard had, just from the point of view of our framework here, Richard didn't have much of a chance anyways, because he couldn't claim heroic credentials, and he could not match Charles II's hereditary credentials or procedural credentials, since he did not have a valid procedural claim stretching back beyond his father, who did not have a procedural claim. Anyway, I think you get the point. Now, if we turn to France, we go across the English Channel, it's a very different situation. So for about 800 years, the Capetian dynasty rules without a break. They produce heir after heir after heir, and over the course of this long period of time, there's a vestigialization of the heroic claim, and tremendous sort of certainty and confidence accrues to the procedural claim. So kings did require strong military support for legitimacy in France, but the HK diagram that we don't have up right now, but with the H on top and the K underneath, is how it is in France for the most part. Worth and power are played out not at the level of the king, but at the level of subordinates in court positions and even in wars, rather than in the development of a robust potential for a heroic claim. That heroic claim simply doesn't develop its potential in France. So you may be familiar with the example of Joan of Arc, and without Joan, Charles VII cannot be crowned in Orleans. Joan is responsible as a military heroine for the coronation of Charles VII. But there's never any sense, she does not claim the throne for herself, despite her frustration with him and despite his weakness. And there's never a great clamoring for Joan to be made the monarch. You know, obviously she doesn't come from monarchical stock, she's a peasant. But it's beyond that. It's the certainty in the Capetian claim. Now, eventually, the integrity of the monarch is not an effective way of fighting corruption. What happens in corruption is that there's a lack of alternation, a lack of disruption in the procedural claim. And so there's a kind of ossified or stiff social structure which allows power and wealth to accrue to subordinate positions within the institutions that stay stable. So because of that, the social and political conditions that develop in France are ripe for the drastic response of revolution. Now, the inheritance, however, of the strong central government remains. So that while you turn to military leaders, you turn to the heroic claim after the end of the monarchy in the 18th century in France, you still have a very strong notion of central government, of the importance of bureaucracy, and so on and so forth, so that the kind of government that develops in Europe following the end of monarchy, following the end of very powerful monarchies, is a government that develops in the 19th century, is still a very strong form of central government. There's really more argument over what type of procedure and what type of procedurally based government there is than an argument between the heroic claim, as there is in England, and the procedural claim. So go back to Henry IV for a second. Henry IV is succeeded by Henry V. So that's one of those phenomenally celebratory Shakespeare heroes. Henry V is the warrior king. In history as well as in literature, he fits the definition of the warrior king. But if we look a little more closely, we can see he didn't have any option but to be a warrior king. So remember, Henry IV claims by a very weak form of heredity, but he actually took the throne by force. He was forced to take the throne by force, you could say, because Richard II had confiscated all of his lands. And so if he didn't act at that moment and act directly by deposing the king and replacing him, he would have had nothing. So Henry IV leaves his son a problem. The problem is the same one we saw with Oliver and Richard Cromwell, that the father claimed heroically, effectively. He did not do that legally, but he did it effectively. The son, however, inherits the throne, so he's procedurally legitimate, but procedural legitimacy has been weakened. And to the extent that it hasn't been weakened, it favors the rivals of Henry IV who have better claims, better procedural claims to the throne. I hope you're able to follow all this. So Henry V comes along, and he's forced to acquire heroic credentials of his own to support his legitimacy. But it's kind of like the notion that presidents go to war when things look bad for them. So here we have Henry V facing this problem that he has to be a warrior king. He has no choice. And he does become that warrior king. He's phenomenally successful in France, and he becomes the fulfillment of the enlightened dualistic ideal. And of course, this doesn't last very long. We're in the midst of the Wars of the Roses, or they're about to begin. And as we can tell from the way the Western system is constructed, with its pessimism is well justified about the possibility of these positions being solidified around particular individuals. And in the wake of the warrior king, things get really bad. So that's it for this talk. In the next and final talk, we're going to look more closely at the Shambhala solution.